Can you believe this is episode 155 on continuing conversations? Isn't that amazing? And it keeps going. We keep thinking we're going to run out of things to talk about, but then all of a sudden we realize there's really important things we haven't talked about. Jim, can you believe that in all our years on this show, we've never had a show dedicated to just empaths and telepaths?
I can't believe it, Michael. I figured we would have gotten there at some point, but I guess not.
Yeah, it just actually blew my mind when this was suggested by one of our fans and one of the person who's going to be on here tonight. I like looked through all of our story. I was like, wow, we've never had a podcast dedicated to just this subject. And how dare we be so remiss? So for everyone, I'm Michael Dismuke. I'm a freelance writer for Star Trek Adventures RPG, lead writer on Captain's Log, solo RPG, and also a blogger on Continuing Missions, which is the #1 fan site for Star Trek Adventures RPG and Captain's Log. Of course, this is not a show without my fellow empath here, Jim Johnson.
Hey everybody, Jim Johnson. I am the project manager and line editor for the Star Trek Adventures RPG first and second edition and the Captain's Log solo RPG out there now. I've been a co-host on this here show with Michael for 155 episodes. We are like right on the cusp of 3 years, man.
Crazy,
hard to believe.
Man.
And now we're talking about empaths and telepaths, which is a topic we haven't touched in 3 years, which goes to show you this franchise is gigantic, and we're gonna need another 10 years before we cover it all, and then by that point there'll be another 10 series out for us to talk about, and the conversation will continue, and we'll do this in the old Star Trek home, and we'll still be talking about Star Trek about all the.
I hope so.
We'll see.
We can play RPG all day long as retired people. That'd be great.
Dig it. I'm there. I'm all for it. Anyway, so moving on then. So we've got a great couple guests here with us tonight to help us talk all about empaths and telepaths in Star Trek and Star Trek RPGs. So without more ado, I'll introduce our guests, and we'll start with Joe. Please introduce yourself. Brilliant.
For everyone who's not a telepath, though, my name's Joe Harney, and I am a returning guest. Thank you to Michael and Jim. I am also a cast member on the Star Trek Preservations podcast RPG, hosted by the wonderful guys over at Tabletop Journeys.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you, Joe. Always happy to have you here. And coming back from just last week, and we're back again. Alex, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be back now. So my name is Alex. I am a professional game master running Star Trek and other games as well on startplaying.games.
Awesome. Thank you for your support. Always appreciate all you and all the other game masters out there that are running the game, playing the game. Really appreciate getting the word out there and getting people to try out Star Trek Adventures and just have fun in the Star Trek universe. It's been an amazing franchise for a long time now, a whole bunch of years ahead of it, certainly, and just great to make the Star Trek family even bigger. So Michael, why don't you kick us off? Tell us what this show's all about and where we're going with it.
Yeah, I mean, pass the ball to me. I actually have to pass the ball to Joe because he's the one who recommended this topic. Joe, what brought us here?
Yeah, so I'm sure as a bunch of our listeners have known that the empath telepath talents have been available for characters of those species that are empathic or telepathic since day one of our first edition. But in the first edition core rulebook, the talent itself was pretty much just said, you are telepathic, go forth and have fun. And so with the recently released second edition, the talent remains fairly unchanged in its nature. And so, but then Jim and Nathan had the temerity to create a new species talent called Open Book for the Beta Z, which pretty much co-opted exactly how I already was using the talent. So I was like, well, what do I do now? And so hence I posed the question and thought we would be a great thing to discuss, not only how to deal with telepaths and empaths in your game, and tips and tricks and how to approach it.
Definitely. And normally, when we tackle the subjects like this, I start with the game master and then say, how would the player deal with it? I actually want to flip it for a reason because I want to start with how players can get into playing these characters. The reason I'm putting game masters second, which we're all game masters here, is because how do you build a story so that an empath and telepath doesn't walk in and ruin the entire plot? Right. And so that's why I'm going to wait for last. So let's first go around and kind of do advice about playing an empath or telepath. What are some reasons why?
Well, can I take the spicy start off with? The spicy
Please
is maybe you shouldn't
tell me.
play
Talk
a
to me.
telepath or an empath. So it is one of the things, because we as sapient individuals, we have our five senses, and there's been many GM books and advice columns written about how to show, not tell, a RPG scene and what your characters are perceiving. Well, empath and telepath literally adds a sixth sense on top of that, and if done incorrectly, can steal a lot of the spotlight from the group and focus it on this one character that needs to keep getting an extra bandwidth of data description from every scene they walk into. And so, that may not be feasible. I think there's only 4 or 5 species in all the Federation species that are naturally empathic. Not, I mean, of course, Beta Z being the most common. There are the Deltans as well, and I think the Haitians use touch contact telepathy, so do the Vulcans. So it's pretty easy to avoid those species if you don't want to kind of accidentally hog the spotlight.
Yeah. Yeah. Alex, what do you think? Cautionary tale for playing telepath empath? You're on mute.
I guess I would say that if you want to play a telepath, like Joe was saying, it's a sixth sense, but like when you're kind of narrating how you go about doing things, you can just use that sixth sense, but like not the fourth and the fifth or whatever. So, some characters would, see like, well, what do I see in the area? You just do the same thing, except you say, well, what do I feel in the area? And you kind of, maybe to mitigate some of that spotlight hogging a little bit, you just like, you don't see things, you only feel things kind of thing. I mean, of course your character sees things unless they're blind, but like, in terms of narratively and what you're using your table time on, just swap it out. Just swap it out for something else.
I love how you said that. How you use your table time, Jim.
Yeah, I think in my experience, the people that want to play empaths and telepaths, at least in Star Trek, understand that there's certain guardrails built around those characters, and there's only so much they can do and can't do with their powers and abilities. So they're not like a constant, they're not like a constant sponge of information. And as a game master, I don't feel like I have to constantly throw notes at them saying, "Okay, here's what you feel about this NPC and that NPC and this NPC, so on and so forth." I think the players that I've had that have been willing to play empaths or telepaths, they've watched the show, they understand kind of the tropes around those specific species. Not to say that a new player coming in couldn't do it. I think you would just need to be aware that like just because you have telepathy doesn't mean you have like mind control powers and you can do the force and you can do everything else, right? There are some very specific, you're kind of in a box in certain respects, and I think we tried to do a decent job in the game to try to like delineate, here's what a Betazoid's parameters are, here's what an Anar's parameters are, and then it'd be up to the game master and the group to kind of stretch that to taste a little bit.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because we have to keep in mind, if I was going to make a comparison to Marvel, which of course where you see all kinds of different telepathy, the telepaths in Marvel or in Star Trek are way more Professor X when it comes to value system, not going into people's brains without permission, stuff like that, compared to Emma Frost. Early days Emma Frost, for those of you who know the character, who's like, no, she's just reading everybody in the room right away and manipulating everything to her in her power. So there is a decorum in Starfleet and the Federation generally about how to use telepathy. We must admit there are characters that live within the Federation who are not Federation, who, if they are telepaths, are more nefarious, maybe. in the way they're using their powers. But generally, if you're playing a Starfleet game, you're respecting of people's private thoughts.
Well, and
go ahead, Joe.
In the Command Division source book, there is a great one-page I can't even call it a sidebar because it's the whole page. But in chapter 5, there's a whole section on telepathy, kind of more because it's the Command Division book, kind of like how it applies in law and JAG, and it can't be used in like the legal process. But it does talk about, and most of the telepathic societies have a very strong prohibition against entering into a mind unwanted. So that's a great resource from the Command Division source book that talks about the do's and don'ts from a telepathic character standpoint.
Yeah, and then I was going to add that Star Trek writers have always found a way to kind of handicap the empaths and telepaths in the group, right? Like if Troy is encountering a species and she wants to support Picard, and the writers don't want her to be able to immediately figure out some certain details. Oh, that species is immune to telepathy, or has natural shielding from empaths or whatever. And like a Ferengi are a good example. A Ferengi are shielded from empaths. So you can find ways to not so much to block it, but just to throw a trait or throw a complication in front of your players to have to figure out.
Yeah, perfect segue. Again, going into the GM side of it. Is that everything we have to say about players taking on an empathic? Or actually, no, I don't think we're done yet. I want to talk a little bit more about players taking on empath and telepathic. How will that affect playing style, do you think? Alex mentioned a little bit about, okay, yeah, you walk into the room and you're going to use your table time to not talk about what you see or smell, but what you feel or hear with your mind, maybe. But really, how can the player lean in on being a telepath or an empath? We're all speaking telepathically, just so you all know.
Well, so I guess I'll kick it off.
Yeah, I found your thought the most interesting, so please go.
Thank you. The one thing because I have actually had the opportunity to play a Beta Z as a STA character, and the thing I found the most difficult was that asking the GM for information that only my character would know, but because we're all around a table and not in like a online medium where they could do a DM or a private message, I was getting information and figuring out contrivances to share that information with the group got burdensome fairly quickly. So there was a lot of times I leaned back into the kind of the background noise, loud conversation in a room, just not scanning anyone unless I was particularly essentially a notable or major NPC, and just leaving kind of the background folks to just background noise, as it were.
Yeah, so I mean, Star Trek or STA has this big thing where it's not meant to kind of simulate like the physics of the reality that you're in. It's kind of like a story generator, right? And it's kind of meant to help you structure something that feels like an episode of the show. And then when you see someone like Anna Troy or whatever in a scene, like when she's in a scene, she's usually there to kind of give some extra information to the crew, right? Like she doesn't really do too much, and the audience as well, right? And so when you're talking about like, when you get information, actually the table is getting information. That's actually also how empaths are used a lot of the time in the show, where as soon as Deanna gets some information, she just immediately tells the bridge crew about it, right? And so you can kind of you play it a little bit more like that, rather than don't treat it like your own little mini game where you're getting a lot of information and then have to choose which stuff is useful for the table. Instead, you need to be looking, as a player, you need to be looking for the opportunities to get some information and prompting prompting the GM at the right times to kind of move the story forward and to kind of, I think a lot of the times GMs just have like a list of clues that they want to give you and they're just looking for excuses to do it. And so like you can just be one of those excuses, like, oh, thank God, like I can, there's a player who's stepping up and giving me an easy way to give them a plot hook or something, right? Or to get, an easy way to get them unstuck if they're feeling a little bit stuck. And I think like an empath can just be like that, almost like a lubricant for the story to like just keep things moving. And there's a lot of different types of characters that'll do it, but empath is just one of those tools.
I like the way you said that. For those people who have watched the last few weeks ago, Jim, myself, Merrick, BC, and Al have been playing Star Trek Adventures 2E. One of the things I really encourage the players to do is look at their traits, meaning in this scene, because you're a Vulcan or because you're a Betazoid, is it possible that the difficulty of this task is less hard? It's less difficult. And so maybe the telepathy in that point isn't getting a point, a direct line of thought to somebody else, but maybe it gave you an extra awareness of the situation that lowered the difficulty of that action. And so therefore now you're playing to who you are as a telepath or empath.
Yeah, and to go along with that, Michael, because I'm playing Ensign Tenon, he's a Betazoid in the show. What I've been trying to do, at least, I don't know how well it's been coming across in the actual gameplay, but at least what I've been thinking about is Star Trek Adventures has this great mechanic called obtain information, right? You spend a momentum, you get to ask an extra question. What I've been trying to do is be intentional about saying, okay, I'm in this scene, I've got my telepathy going, I'm going to obtain information, but instead of maybe asking a specific verbal question or saying, what can I see? What can I hear? What am I feeling? What am I sensing from the player characters or the non-player characters around me? Am I getting a vibe from them? Am I sensing any, deceit or whatever? And so I'm trying to tap into that a little bit. So it's kind of like almost like passive sensors. Like what am I picking up on the surface before I start trying to do a deep dive? Of course, and then there was that one episode where I got completely caught
I was
by
just
doing
about to notice that. Yeah. Well, there was that episode where you got caught doing it by Delton, but then there was also another episode where you figured out a huge clue about the captain of the ship, just using again that trait and that obtain information. Very good, Joe.
Now, real quick, Jim, I don't know if I remember from the quick start. Does the lieutenant, the Beta Z, does he also have the new species talent, the open book one, or is it just
he does not have open book. He just has the species ability.
okay? Because I got the new edition and I was reading that one, and because that one lets you specifically for having the talent, you can do what you were doing. Spend the momentum and to ask questions about the emotions or surface thoughts. So that made me kind of go like, well, have I been doing this wrong the whole time? Should I not be letting my empathic or telepathic characters spend momentum to obtain information without having the talent? And so it kind of threw a
No.
curveball
No, I think
at me.
it's two different angles. I think just the standard straight up obtain information, spend the momentum, ask the question. Whether you're doing that just like verbally asking the question, or if you have an empath or telepath who can do it, I think that's perfectly fine. I think what open book does is it's a little bit more it's depending on how the scene is set up, because like the moment that scene starts, if your Betazoid is in there, they can immediately ask a question like before the scene even begins, right? And I think that's a different approach to like the regular use of obtaining information, which in my experience anyway usually comes after you've completed a skill, after you've completed a task, right? Like Michael, I think every time I've used obtain information in our games, it was only after something happened. We made a task attempt, we succeeded at the task attempt, we had some extra momentum to spend. It's like, oh well, now I'm going to lean into my telepathy and do it. I think open book just kind of preempts that and says like immediately upon entering the scene, what does Troy pick up, what does whoever pick up. So I think you're doing it just fine, Joe.
My narrative explanation for that would be that there are Betazoids who are better telepaths, and there are some who are lesser empaths. Like not like telepathy, like Deanna Troy is able to receive telepathy with her mother or other betazoids, but we've never seen her in the show just jump out to a human and talk telepathy. Even with Will Riker, it's Imzadi. It's just this close bond that they have, right? So I would almost say that somebody with the open book talent is more polished, meaning when they walk into a room, they just start getting it if they choose to. Whereas I think Jim, your character, who's an ensign, a little younger, maybe has not honed their skills, has to kind of really buckle down to push and get that information. That's how I narratively would explain it.
Okay. No, that's a great way to think of it.
All right. Anything else on player? We're talking about betazoids, but what about Vulcans or there are actual species in the Federation, especially in TOS, that are very strong telepaths, even psychokinesis or not transfiguration, transmutation of objects, right? Those are different powers. So are we talking about that? Are we including that when we talk telepaths and empaths? Are we even talking about psychokinetics and stuff like that? Or is that a whole different subject?
I think that's a different podcast because we have the whole exotic talent trees to explore. So you got 3 more future episodes lined up.
Esoteric talents. You're right. Okay, cool. So any other player advice on telepaths and empaths before we jump into how do GMs prepare for players with these powers?
I will say one thing kind of on the Vulcan one, because again, there is the mind meld talent, which again goes towards that, has practiced it and has enough discipline in it to do it well and effectively. So I'm thinking I'll use the kind of the same logic on the Beta Z open book talent, is that they're, practiced as it were.
Yeah. Can we talk about some cautionary and some safeties, especially when we talk about mind meld or any telepath? What are some things you may want to have to session 0 with players about when it comes to if they are playing a telepath in regards to the style of game you may have? I'll give it to Alex because to me, he's the king of session 0 because I sat through one of his.
Yeah. So I mean, safety tools. I think there's in Star Trek, telepathy and kind of those close telepathic connections are often portrayed as something that's really intimate. And even in the universe, we talked earlier about how telepaths in the Federation are very mindful of privacy and not being intrusive, that kind of thing. You might just want to just discuss that really quickly, but then also, if you want to set up some strict safety tools where it's we're not going to use telepathy in any way that's sexual or another way. I usually don't even in most of my games, not all of them, but most of my games, torture is off the table, both physical, but also, mental of I don't, you might want to say, we're not going to do a scene where a telepath is getting into your brain and breaking you down into a child version of yourself or something like that. We're just not going to play that out, and just kind of getting that agreement ahead of time and making sure that everybody kind of understands that. Depending on the game, if that's something that you want to kind of play around with, I think the other cool thing about safety tools is that it, while kind of providing a safe table for people who don't want to do those kinds of things, it also provides a safe environment for people who do want to be well, let's do an episode like the You Have Four Lights kind of episode, or they not you have, There Are Four Lights episode, where it's it's a torture episode, right? It's a episode all about torture. And if you want to do an episode like that, you can put in those safety tools of kind of talk about where the boundaries are and how to kind of regulate that. And I think with telepathy specifically, if you wanted to do an episode that is entirely cerebral, maybe a one-on-one kind of session of somebody kind of trying to dig into the brain of somebody else or resolving somebody's past kind of trauma. The Picard season 2 had this big thing where he was exploring his memories. There's no telepath involved there, but you could do, I don't think they could do a thing where, somebody was exploring somebody's memories and getting into old trauma and stuff like that. And if you're doing that kind of thing, just kind of put in some boundaries about what type of content that you want to include and don't want to include.
Well, I know some players wouldn't be feel comfortable with the Star Trek 6, Spock when he went to mind meld with Lieutenant Valoris. Like that, some people were like, "Ooh, that's really off-putting. What did Spock do there?" So we may think, "Oh, it's no big deal, Spock," but that was actually a rare thing for Spock to do in extreme circumstances, kind of thing. So game masters shouldn't assume that all their players are okay with that kind of scene, right?
Right. And so, and just to what Alex was saying on the safety tools, I generally view telepathy and empathy as just another. It's a vehicle of telling the story. So the subjects and themes that are off limits, because like you said, you can torture someone physically, you can torture someone mentally. If torture is off the table, then it's like I usually don't feel super necessary to say, well, physical torture is fine, but telepathic tortures avail. I tend not to separate that unless the group wants to have go in that direction and explore in that way. But especially after watching the end of Picard season 3, that's some fertile ground for some psychological exploration going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in addition to the safety tools, I would just add something we talked about briefly at the top of the show, is to just like whatever players are interested in playing the empaths or telepaths, and also just the whole group as a whole, just lay out what those ground rules are. Here's what telepathy does, not just in the Star Trek setting, but for the purposes of our game. Here's what you can do with it. Here's what you can't do with it, unless you're really making an effort to create traits or to really flex the power into a different direction, just so that everybody's on the same page and they know how far to go or not to go with the empathy or the telepathy. I don't know if that's necessarily a safety rule in specific, as it is just laying down the ground rules for how your version of the universe operates.
Yep. Good. All right. Very good advice. I think things to keep in consideration. Of course, if you've already all started your games and didn't do this, for us, Session Zero always continues. We keep a channel open where we're like, hey, by the way, new subject to discuss, and we tweak the story accordingly. So it's never too late to get it right. All right. So now the hard part, game masters. How do you build your game so that, like, for instance, just to give an example for anybody who wants to go back and watch the game we played, myself, BC, Merrick, Jim, Al, we played the first episode was called USS Tranquil, which you can still look up on continuing missions and continuing conversations to take a look at how we played that game. And I was posed with a challenge because we had a bad captain. Spoiler alert, people. We had an evil captain, a pirate captain, and then all of a sudden Jim decides he's going to pick the Betazoid. I'm like, how am I going to tweak my story so that in Act 1 the bad guy is not revealed? So I had to definitely make some tweaks to the story. There was not a Deltan originally mentioned in the mission brief I wrote. So I said, well, I'm going to use that as an excuse that this person has some, basic psychic abilities so they can actually block their emotions if necessary. That's something I did to fix it. Any other advice going around? How do you make it so that your telepaths and empaths don't unravel your whole games?
Well, sometimes I've done in the past is I'll lean into it. I will give them the information, but because they got it telepathically, they can't act on it. And then watch them try and find the evidence to kind of backfill the justification so that they can say, like, he's evil, not because I sensed it, but because I have X, Y, and Z evidence.
Wow. Do we have any episodes of Star Trek like that?
I don't know if we do, because it's not a subject that really, all the really amazing drumhead courtroom drama ones have not involved telepathy at all. So they've just kind of, as the writers have just kind of avoided it.
There
But
was one in Voyager where someone incited B'Elanna Torres with an evil thought or a violent thought, which led to a murder. They were passing something through, and there was like a court case around that, but it wasn't quite.
Well, and then there was Tuvok and the evil Beta Z guy, and they had the cat and mouse while Tuvok was trying to prove what he did.
That's right. That's true. Whew. Okay. Any other GM?
So just because something's happened doesn't mean you can prove it and prove it enough to act on it.
Yeah. Yeah, I do something similar where, I mean, to be honest, even without an empath, I'm like myself a pretty bad liar in a couple different ways. So sometimes I just lie in a way that the players clock me right away, and sometimes I lie in a way that's like too bad, and I kind of forget to give clues sometimes, and so when you get to the reveal, they're like, "Well, that's just random," right? Like it's like, oh yeah, it's because I forgot to tell you that this other thing should have happened in a scene, or like I'm just really bad at kind of setting up those kind of deceptions for the players. And so a lot of the time I'll lean into, okay, if the players are going to get all of the information from characters that they're in a scene with, things that are happening off screen are different because I don't have to talk about it. But if the characters are in a scene with an NPC and that character is like lying or they're hiding something or whatever, and they're going to know that. And so even if there's not a telepath, I usually kind of play it up. I get like instead of having a sneaky captain, I just have a captain who's just a complete jerk, and kind of says what he wants out of the gate. And then the question from the players is not, can you find the truth here? Then the players is like, okay, well, you know he's lying, or you know that they're hiding something. What are you going to do about it? And sometimes that's a much trickier puzzle for players to play out. Like what Joe was saying is like, well, how are you going to find the evidence to prove it? Or sometimes it's just like, well, okay, you know he's going to, I don't know, somebody's going to blow something up. How are you going to stop them? And then you get into just a different kind of mode of play. And if you have an empath in the room, then that's just a vehicle where you can kind of give them that information and you can kind of move the story along that way. And it's just a tool that the players can use in their belt to do something about it once they have that information.
Yeah. Any ideas, Jim?
And
Yeah, I think I like to feel empowered as a game master, because having an empath or a telepath in the group just gives me another avenue of delivering information to the players, right? So I'm hitting their five senses, but I'm also, now I get to play with the sixth sense, right? And I can throw red herrings at them. I can throw key pieces of information at them that they have to figure out how are they going to impart that information to their fellow players, right? I mean, obviously the players are going to know because they're all around the table, but in character, how are they going to do that? Like it's always an interesting exercise to see how players do that. But for me as a game master, it's just like, okay, I've got another way to get information to them. And that's also useful, especially if you're running a campaign, because if your empath slash telepath hasn't been that involved in certain episodes, leaning into their telepathy or empathy is a kind of a way to get them involved. It's like, not to say that it's a spotlight episode for them specifically, but it's like, okay, if you weren't here, this episode would be different because we wouldn't be delivering the information empathically or telepathically. So it just adds a different perspective to it, and it gets it gets that player pulled in a little bit more because you're using one of their traits that's unique to that character, presuming that they're the only empath or telepath in the group, which in my experience is generally the case. There's usually only one or two at most in a group, because people like to diversify and have different kind of shticks going on. So it's just it's a useful way to, and of course, as a game master, I always love mining the character sheets and finding important things to target for each person, just to pull them into the game a little bit more. You get that more immediate engagement when you're actually focusing on their backstories or their traits, as opposed to just kind of like generically getting the crew involved.
well, and I remember in one of the games I was running, the group really honed in on activating one of their supporting characters who was a telepath, and so at the I can't remember the name of the mission that I tweaked from the wonderful library of STA products that are out there, but it was they were at a reception before a big diplomatic conference, and they brought in the supporting character, and so I had the supporting character accidentally overhear the thoughts of one of the attaches who was part of the whole assassination plot, and then had the empath character break down to the PCs about what he'd overheard, and then when the PCs went to confront the government people, they wanted that NPC prosecuted for telepathic invasion of privacy and sent it all down that direction. So
Yes. Playing off of like, sometimes you overhear something, sometimes with telepathy being just a mode that the GM can deliver information, something that I do all the time with players is players will look at it, they'll attempt to do something, they'll look at their attributes in the departments. It's like, well, I don't know, it's kind of sciencey, it's kind of engineering, it's kind of reasoning, it's kind of insighty, right? And I said, you know what? I think all of those could sort of apply a bit. Choose one that you like, but the one that you choose is going to inform the type of outcome that you get out of this, right? And so if you're fixing some kind of machine with an engineering background, you're gonna fix it in a way that's engineering-ish, right? And in a science way that you're gonna get slightly different results. But with obtaining information specifically, it's really easy to just be like, well, you're gonna get science information out of this if you're researching with science, and you're gonna get engineering information out of this if you're researching something from an engineering perspective or whatever. And telepathy is just another one of those of like, okay, so now you have your engineering information about the situation, you have your science information about the situation, you have your medicine, whatever, all the departments, and then you have the telepathy type information, which is just kind of inner thoughts, and it's just another set of ways that players can approach it. And so they're getting different information than they would otherwise, and it's not like taking a telepathic character is kind of a waste or anything like that, because you're just moving things along. You're getting different information than you would have gotten if you were not a telepath.
I love that you said that too, because we talked about red herrings earlier. People, I've never assumed that if I was a telepath, that the thoughts I hear someone else telling me are necessarily true. Just to give everyone some framing around here, imagine if you went into the thoughts of, say, your favorite politician or a politician you don't like so much. They may actually think they're right. Those are actually thoughts in their head, and that's what you get. It doesn't make it necessarily the truth. So I've often done that with telepathy is, sure, go in their head. You still have to verify whether it's actionable or not. Even if someone is, say, fantasizing about a crime or whether they're really plotting a crime. That's a whole nother level of telepathy to be a truth teller or to be able to a human lie detector or a Vulcan lie detector, right?
yeah, I was gonna say I've been in some of those meetings where I've thought if thought crimes were real crimes, I'd be in trouble.
Exactly. Right. And especially if people are aware a telepath is around, I could see pirates, for you can't be read anyways, but I could see pirates or some of the scurrilous, nefarious characters that are on trade routes knowing exactly how to throw off telepaths and empaths.
Well, and to kind of pivot around what Alex's point on the like telepathic information, the one thing I did that I found was super helpful for me is I just went on the internet and I Googled emotional color wheel. And there are probably an infinite number of color wheels out there to describe the emotions of that are available in the human character. I found one that I particularly like because it broke it down in like 3 successive tiers. And I'm going to go ahead for those who are watching on YouTube. I'm going to share my screen for it. This one comes from the Junto Institute for Entrepreneurial Leadership. And the thing I really like about it is because it also kind of ties into the 6 departments. Michael, is that sharing for you? Or do I have to click on something more?
No, you're not sharing yet. Click on share. There you go.
There we go.
Now it's sharing. And for everyone who is not watching this on the podcast, go back to this continuing missions article, and I'll make sure to put this color wheel in here so you can look at it later.
Right. And the one thing I really like about this specific wheel from the Junto Institute is that it has it has 6 core emotions, and just going from around the wheel, it's got love, fear, anger, sadness, surprise, and joy. And these are kind of like the 0 difficulty emotional surface thought reads I give my empath telepaths. And then if they want to dig deeper or spend more momentum, I go to the next level because each of the 6 core emotions has 8 corresponding sub emotions. So joy has enthralled, elation, enthusiastic, optimistic, proud, cheerful, happy, and content. And then on the third ring, each of those ones has 2 tertiary emotions that go with it. So, like, content has pleased or satisfied.
I
And so
love this.
it
I love this.
lets me drill down quite a bit and give a lot of nuanced texture to the description, and gives some empaths some like choice, a meaningful choice on how deep they want to go. But also what I do is I increase the complication range each step they go down, so to
Ooh.
be noticed and like offended by the depth of the look.
Joe, please tell me you're going to do an article just about this for continuing missions, because that what you just described. Because well, let me tell you what's so cool about this. For those who can't again see, well, just listening to the podcast, it went from, in the case that Joe gave, it went from joy to content to pleased. So I'm looking at that word pleased, and there's things that villains would do that would give them pleasure, yet would not give any indication to an empath what they're pleased about. Right? Like what's is it, are they pleased because maybe they wanted to be stopped their crime, or are they pleased because it actually went through and they successfully distracted you and the real crime is still going to happen? So man, as a game master, I'm looking at this right now and I could really think ahead, like, ooh, what's the motivation of my characters that might be scanned during the show? This is deep. Thank you, Joe, for
Yeah.
sharing that.
And I think if I'm doing the math correctly, 6 times 8 times 2, there's like 84 emotions attached in this color wheel alone that you can use to be descriptive. And like I said, I use it in that multi-dimensional path. So the surface slots are just the 6, and you can mix and match. You can do, you get love, fear, and surprise. Like
Right. Can someone be angry and joyful at the same time? I mean,
absolutely right.
emotions are complex.
I love when interests intersect. I use this emotion wheel all the time in my writing, so it's an easy transition to use it as a game mastering tool as well.
That is so fantastic. I love stuff like that. Okay, so Joe, you promised me you'll do a little article with some game mechanics about you just described, and I'll also add this wheel to this episode when I post it on Continuing Mission, which is super cool.
Yeah, because essentially this is what I've done in the free white space that Jim created in the mechanics for empathy and telepathy. That when I have my players make a roll, I give them, do you want it to be a 1, 2, or 3 difficulty, and do you want, do you want the challenge rating to increase by 1 or by 2? And then you can get all of them. But again, even if I tell you he's disillusioned, satisfied, romantic, frightened, inadequate, agitated, annoyed.
Yeah,
About
that's
what?
a lot. Right. That's a lot. Jim, he just made your life harder for your character, just so you know, because I'm so like,
But I'm eager for that, right? I'm all for it because that means you're tying into something specific about the character, and you're not just throwing a random plot hook our way. There's actually something specific about the Betazoid that I can dig into.
yeah, this makes me think about the rule that Al Spader created in the Federation Klingon War book about trauma. There's a whole trauma rule there. And I was thinking, boy, couldn't you do it so that maybe some previous life instance makes your empath or telepath hypersensitive to a specific type of emotion too, that could totally send them on a red herring, right? Wouldn't that be a potential?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think any of these words on the emotion wheel could be a trait or a potent trait.
Exactly.
Right? You could be facing somebody who's enraged too, or is jealous, or um, disillusioned. I mean, there's so many synonyms that you can use, but like maybe you're going into a trade agreement and you got somebody who's just completely traumatized. And it's got nothing to do with this specific trade agreement, but it's just like that's what they're bringing to the table. And it's like, okay, how do you navigate through or around that. Right?
Wow. Even as an extended task, because telepaths are going for specific information all the time, but as an extended task, I might make the telepath have to work through these levels of emotion. And once they work through these, which may have corresponding visual effects and flashbacks and stuff like that, once they finish getting through that, now they get the information they want.
Well, and Michael, to your point on extended tasks, I've also used this with the ship's counselor and doing an extended task for doing therapy and working through emotional trauma that gets inflicted on Starfleet officers every third episode, it seems. And building a vocabulary, to let them have something to sink their teeth into, and so I'm very frequently handing out the traits, fear, horror, mortified, and then having them have to go back and do some B plot to spend some time on the counselor's couch.
I
Dealing
love
with that.
this. I mean, I love, or even
Especially with the new
yeah.
way that stress works. It's no longer just physical stress. It's the mental stress track now. Goes right into this whole color wheel.
I'm sitting here riffing in my brain. Someone else take it. I could go. I could riff on this.
I'm just taking notes. I'm just stealing all of this.
As part of the riff, one of the things that was being talked about earlier in the episode was about how what was the specific discussion that you can spin this off into a separate conversation with a character. That's an opportunity. Like if a player character wants to explore some trauma or some deeper feelings or something, but not, for lack of a better word, not burden the other players with that whole sidebar conversation in the game. You could grab Captain's Log or just grab the rule set in the game master and just do a separate subplot session on the side and just play through that entire emotional journey, and just for the catharsis of doing it with your character in character, and have that whole experience. And then you can come back to the group a week later, a couple weeks later, whatever, and say, hey, here's the little short story I pulled together by using Captain's Log or just by working with the game master through an extended task. Right? Extended task is a great way to do that, because you can hang all kinds of little events off of each breakthrough or each certain number of sections through the extended task. There's lots of ways to play with it.
Well, I mean, I can even see making an extended consequence where there's some sort of virus going around that starts people being sad. And as the consequence gets worse, they go into these deeper negative emotions that have to start acting through them.
Well, and also your 50%, 75% breakthrough could be going back up the color wheel. So your grief, but then you can get your breakthrough. So then you're just to despair. And then you get your next breakthrough and you're just sad. Right.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And there's other emotion wheels too, right?
There's 1,000 out there.
So you could really pull these out and find a bunch. Boy, Jim, too bad you're not doing, I don't know if you are, but Empath or Telepath supplement. This would be like the whole foundation of the
I would love to see a like a full, but basically an emotion wheel for every species. Right. Ooh. So like Vulcans kind of like rearranging some of the things that are already there so that something that was under surprise or something is now under joy for another species. And then you get kind of like different flavor depending on who you're interacting with.
Oh my God. Imagine
four out of 6 of the Vulcan ones is just logical.
No, to your point, I right away thought about Sicarians who pleasure and all the different ways they derive pleasure are key to their society. Anything that does not bring them pleasure is just like, visceral. Oh, I'd love to see a Sicarian emotion.
Yeah. Or like Vulcans just have like fewer things on that first ring, right? So maybe there's only 2 things that you can get out of a Vulcan on it because they're very closed off. They're giving very little information on the surface. And then as you go deeper, there's more and more, and it gets maybe more intense as you go in a variety of different ways. There's a lot you can do with that. It's so good.
And oh my goodness. And what if you do get that deep into it? It triggers some sort of effect. Like you don't want to go that deep with the Vulcan.
Yeah, you could play with the complication range, or you could play with other things, because theoretically certain Vulcans have firewalled off certain emotions, right? And they've repressed those, or they've either repressed them or firewalled them. But you present them with a significant scene with certain things happening that really pushes at those repressed feelings or whatever. And it's like, okay, now how do you deal with that? Now you've got, a different complication track. You've got an extended task or an extended challenge. There's a lot of ways there's a lot of levers you can pull now to really pull that together.
Well, and to Jim's point with the complication, like that you can use like the bleed over, like the feelings are transferring across up to and including the amusing Strange New World episodes with Spock and Topang, where they full on that was quite a complication that they had to work through in that episode.
This is great. This is amazing. I just found another color wheel just to show people how cool this is. There's one that has fear, disgust, joy, genius, anger, and sad. And fear as you move through it, which again, session 0 stuff, but fear has a point where it's uncontrollable and even going to the point of addicted. So just the story possibilities here, like how these emotions exhibit, and then trying to figure out having your characters, especially in Star Trek, which is such a diplomatic game too, with diplomacy. It's like, what is it helps me develop a better NPC whose emotions are a little richer, but then what's the root cause of them? And that's the game, is finding out the motivation, and therein lies the problem that the heroes have to solve. I mean, I just love, Joe, you introducing this. This is fodder for someone like any GM, who's trying to develop really good characters.
Well, and then conversely, on the other topic, you could use an emotional color wheel to kind of illustrate the point that, despite all of our differences, our IDIC, kind of the sub programming, the emotional underpinning of conscious sapient creatures, because we all share the origination point from the creators, the progenitors, that we all kind of share this same emotional underpinning,
I love
as
that.
all things are connected in the universe.
We may have to have a whole episode just about the emotion wheel, honestly, because I do want to mention one other thing about GMing telepaths and empaths, structuring in ways to nullify their powers that are not redundant. You can't be doing it every episode. It can't happen. It has to be believable so that the player even goes, yeah, I understand that. So let's talk about that. What are the caveats if you're nullifying the powers? What are acceptable ways to do so, as long as you don't do it too much?
I mean, I'll grab the low hanging fruit and say other stronger telepaths, empaths blocking them, right? As you showed in the Delton captain, in the quick start play.
The one that I picked up from somewhere on the internet was for people who are not powerful empaths, but still have received some training on how to block them out, like humans, for example. They just get a song stuck in their head, right? And intentionally, and then the song is just like keep going and going and going. I think most players will kind of feel like they get that surface level science. It's like, oh, they're just singing like the wheels on the bus go round and round over and over again. It's so annoying. And if they want to push through that and kind of get through that and see what's underneath that surface thought, then maybe that can be a test or something like that. But yeah, it's something that basically anybody could be able to do, but probably something that only happens if it's a character who could believably have training and also be aware that there's other empaths around.
Well, and I
that.
believe
Love that.
originally it was in the command source book, and then it got carried over into 2E. There is actually a focus about mental discipline, so that would be a very easy way to say that this character has stronger mental defenses.
Well, I like that. And I'm now that you've said it, Joe, and I'm a visual learner, I really see again increasing the complication range to get through those mental defenses. Difficulty 1 for those surface thoughts, 2, 3, like as a GM, I see constructing around that. What are other ways to nullify telepaths and empaths in acceptable ways? What do you think?
Yeah, I think you have to be careful because the worst thing to do to a player is to give them the ability to have a cool thing and then just constantly take it away from them, right? I mean, that always frustrates. And not to switch, not to cross the streams, but I remember early days of playing Star Wars. Like I was playing a young Jedi in the old West End games D6 version, and I was so excited to have a lightsaber, but my game master always found ways to not let me use it. I was like, what's the point of giving me this tool if I can't ever use it, right? And so to be an empath or a telepath and to constantly be faced with alien species who are naturally resistant to telepathy or empathy, or there's some sort of subspace technobabble, technoscience interference that's blocking it, that gets old after a while. Because like I wanted to play an empath, I wanted to do something interesting and different, and you're preventing me from it episode after episode after episode. So I think you're right, Michael. I think finding novel ways to do it that make sense and are reasonable, and you don't keep pushing the same button over and over again. But then also sometimes, be willing to let your players play a heroic character with a cool power and let them do something cool with it, right? Once in a while.
Yeah, I
but
think,
just I was going to say, just in terms of like practical things, you've got all kinds of Star Trek interference that can occur, whether it's naturally occurring or artificially occurring. You've got nefarious people who like to use various and sundry, poisons, medicines, other techniques to block it. I think, especially with second edition, I think using Joe mentioned using stress as a mental as well as a physical thing. Your character is exhausted, and you're not thinking straight, or you're not thinking as clear as you normally do. How's that going to have an impact on your emotional well-being and your emotional balance and your ability to pick up emotions? Right? Maybe you start feeling something and you're not sure if it's coming from you or if you're reflecting it from somebody else, right? Like maybe you wake up one day and you're just irrationally angry, and you're also just so tired, right? Your stress is so low that you can't identify, is the anger coming from me or is it coming from somebody else who's like projecting it onto you? And that would present a mystery that you have to solve. So I think there's a lot of creative ways to play with it. Alex, I do love your idea of the song in your head, and now that you've mentioned it, I vaguely remember there being a Next Gen episode where Troy was hearing music all episode long until the climax. And now I'm gonna have to go down the rabbit hole after the episode and try to remember which episode was that where she was hearing music, because it just sparked a memory in me that I think we've seen something like that, but maybe not. I'm not sure now.
For dealing with telepaths, I'm into designing the environment so even though they can use their power, it doesn't solve the problem. For instance, rescues and ship distresses and cave-ins happen all the time. So maybe the telepath can sense what's going on and help with the rescue effort, but their telepathy is not going to help at all. Or how many people are on that ship that we're trying to rescue? Oh, there's a couple of bodies over here. We still got to get through bulkheads in order to solve it. So I think that GM does have the burden of work to say, you know what, design the episode. Some things I've done, Jim's experienced before, where I throw so much cacophony and chaos going on that for a telepath or empath to use their powers and so direct and control the thing, they're going to actually have to get make the situation calm first. Otherwise, all of those traits actually increase the difficulty of them to be able to use their empathy or use their telepathy. But the players can understand that and accept that. And if everyone is going through the same thing, ship getting blown up, Klingons attacking, yeah, there's a pretty good reason why your telepathy is not going to be focused right now.
And so on that, Michael, just think about also the possibility of using a scene trait, right? In a tense battle scene, like you with a telepath in the group, you might want to consider stressful thoughts or in the air, like fear and panic radiating from the crew as a scene trait. That's making telepathy more difficult.
Well, I like that because as much as telepathy can benefit you, it can also hinder you in that kind of situation. And that's narratively accepted from most players, right? That's something you see a lot on TV. All right. Very good. We're still talking telepathic.
Well, I will just on Jim's point on the taking it away, like this is like an age-old GMing issue. Like I used to call it the Cavalier conundrum because in Dungeons and Dragons, one of the red book things, there was a subclass of the paladin called the cavalier that you got all this really cool stuff if you were on a war horse, and then your GM would like take you into the sewers where you couldn't bring your horse. And so it was all very much that kind of thing. So that's a pitfall that has been with us since probably the dawn of gaming.
Yeah. So thank you.
Go ahead, Michael.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say it's an example of maybe an example of a game master not quite sure how to handle all the cool stuff that their players are bringing to the table. Like all these great character concepts, and they're like, oh, what do I do with that? I can't figure out how to make that fit into my plan. So I'm just going to throw roadblocks in the way. And yeah, I think a lot of us hopefully grow out of that.
Yeah. If my players thwart me once, I'm happy. Like my goal is to let them thwart me. I don't want to be thwarting them. So it's my responsibility. If they thwart me that way, it's like, okay, got me once, it's not going to happen again. I'll think a way to structure next time. Very good. Very good. Anything else on telepaths empaths before we head over to gratitude?
I don't know. I just as a general encouragement to players and game masters, I would say lean into it. It's something that we don't see a huge amount on Star Trek, although with Hemmer as a Anar, and of course Troy as a Betazoid, and we see Spock, of course Spock. Spock is an interesting character because I think Nimoy was really trying to stretch what a Vulcan could do, and he was really spending a lot of time defining what a Vulcan was with all the different powers and stuff. And I think if you watch him play it through in a bunch of those episodes, there's some interesting things that Spock was doing that don't really show up in the mechanics such as they are in Star Trek Adventures. But like there was times where you'd see the character, like, you know, he'd put his hand against the wall and he'd think really hard, and the guard on the other side of the wall would have this intuition to do something, right? And that's just cool, right? That tells me that's Spock's player really trying to create traits, right, and find ways to creatively use their abilities to do something outside the scope of the rules. And I think if you have a good rapport with your game master and your other players, you know, be willing to take what's written raw in the book, but then be willing to stretch a little bit. I think the game gives you the tools to spend a little bit of momentum, or give the game master a little bit of threat, create a trait, or modify a trait, and play with it and see what you can do with it.
Yeah, and on that, say yes. It's the watchword of improvisational gaming. How to get to yes, and lean into, and don't feel burdened if you need to take a minute, step back, have an outside game conversation with your player on like, what are they trying to do? How are they envisioning this working, so that you can help facilitate a great story, and make sure you're all pulling on the same rope in the same direction.
Yeah. Alex, any final words?
No, I don't really have much to add, but you know, I'm just gonna say the say yes thing is probably the biggest thing. Any kind of big powers or whatever, it's the most common advice, but it's one that's worth like repeating, because it's easy to forget. You look at a big power and you can get scared of it, but then if you just say yes, usually it works out, because I think the player also just wants to have a good story. So as long as you're working together on that, that's great.
Exactly. Well, fantastic. I am so glad you thought of this subject, Joe, to bring onto the show. I can't believe it took us this long to get it done. And so let's go ahead and do some gratitude. I'm going to give gratitude not only to Joe, but to so many of our people on social media who are always asking great questions. It boggles my mind that we have so many subjects to talk about 155 episodes in. And honestly, we're only here because people keep tuning in, listening, asking questions, or creative people like, you know, Alex, who are taking the lead as game mastering. Joe, again, you play with tabletop games, all these people out there who are constantly developing and morphing this game. So my gratitude goes to all you creatives out there who are participating. Let's go, Joe, then Alex, then Jim. Joe, gratitude.
Perfect. Yeah, I'd be remiss if I didn't express my gratitude to the Tabletop Journeys fellows and our amazing podcast that we produce and put out every Tuesday is Star Trek Preservations, where we follow along the crew of the USS Delamis Christian, a Saber class Federation starship that is exploring the bounds of the what it means to be Starfleet in the post-Dominion era, when everything's still kind of politically shaky. So,
Heidi, Alex.
I'm gonna, since you gave it to me first, I'm gonna go ahead and take the thing that I think everybody else is thinking of right now, which is I am so thankful for this emotion wheel thing. I'm going to steal the heck out of this and play with that. I really hope, Joe, that you write something up with all the different ways that you could use this, because I looked at it and at first I was like, oh yeah, that's a little bit neat. But then when you started talking about like how you tied mechanics to it, I was like, whoa, there's so much you could do with it. And I'm very, very thankful for that.
We'll all be staring at it tonight.
Yeah.
Like, oh, this is like, oh. Take us out, Jim.
Well, I feel, I don't feel guilty, but I'm just amused. Like I said, that the how hobbies and interests cross over, because I literally have that emotion wheel saved on my desktop, because in my writing I always reference it in my writing. So anytime I'm stuck with a character or a backstory or something, I'll pull up that emotion wheel and figure out where exactly are they on it. So the fact that you presented the exact same one, I'm like, yay! We can use it in multiple places, not just writing, not just RPGs, but in both, or in other. I'm sure there's other places you can use it too, especially if you're like a counselor or whatever. But so I'm grateful to both of you for being on the show with us, being willing to come back. Alex, you've come back. Joe, you've come back. So thank you for coming back and talking with us about these great topics. Thanks for being active online, either running games or just being involved in the community. Thank you for that, and also thank you to all the fans. Again, like Michael said, if you weren't asking great questions or being involved in the online community, we probably wouldn't have done 3 years of this show. I'm sure, there's always something new to talk about, but we may not have been this consistent. So thank you for all your support of Star Trek Adventures and for Star Trek in general. And we'll look forward to the next shows. But again, if you're like Joe and you've got cool questions and cool ideas that you want to see on the show, say something. Post it on the boards. Because we're Michael and I, we're on the boards everywhere. We're on Discord, we're on Facebook, we're on Reddit, etc. So we're not hard to find, and we're reading everything. So if you got a cool idea for a show, we'll certainly grab it, but be prepared, because we might ask you to come on the show and be that.
You're not shy, yeah, exactly.
It's always that challenge, right? Don't volunteer for something unless you're willing to jump in, right? So if you have a great idea, we might just say, okay, that's a great idea. Join us on the show. Let's talk about it.
That's right. This show was started by the fans for the fans. This is a fan-centric show, so that's why we love having y'all on.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, until next time, everyone, IDIC.
Live long and prosper, y'all. Be safe, be well. We'll talk to you all next time.
Today is a good day not to die.